September 10th, 1944. The rain had not stopped for 2 days, turning the French countryside into a maze of mud and fog. The Third U.S. Army was pushing east, its armored columns grinding forward through shattered villages and flooded roads. Inside one of the lead M4 Sherman tanks, 5 men sat in near silence. The gunner, Sergeant Frank Doyle, peered through his periscope, his world reduced to streaks of gray and drifting smoke. The commander, Lieutenant Harold King, was hunched over a damp map lit by the flicker of a red flashlight. A junction appeared out of the mist. The signpost ahead had been blown apart, one arm twisted toward Metz, the other unreadable. King hesitated, glanced at the compass, then gave a quick order. "Left! We'll swing south to link up with Baker Company." The tank growled and turned down the narrow road, its treads chewing through the mud. None of them knew it yet, but that single wrong turn would lead them straight into the path of a German general's staff car and change the course of an entire sector of the front. By early September 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a chaotic, fluid stage. The German army, broken and retreating from the Normandy front, was being driven relentlessly eastward. What had begun as a slow, brutal slog through the hedgerows of northern France was now a high-speed pursuit. Allied forces, American, British, and Canadian, were racing toward the German border, trying to crush what was left of Hitler's western defenses before they could regroup. At the center of this drive stood General George S. Patton's Third Army. In barely a month, Patton's tanks had rolled across more than 600 miles, liberating hundreds of towns and capturing tens of thousands of prisoners. His divisions operated with a kind of organized chaos. Bold thrusts, rapid flanking, and supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Fuel was always short, maps were often outdated, and communication between units could lag hours behind movement. For the men on the ground, this meant one thing: confusion. Columns became separated, platoons lost contact, and small units often found themselves isolated deep in enemy territory, unsure of where friend or foe might be. The front was no longer a line. It was a web, fragile, shifting, and full of deadly surprises. Among the armored formations advancing toward eastern France was the 37th Tank Battalion, part of General John S. Wood's 4th Armored Division. These men were veterans of Normandy, hardened by weeks of fighting through dense countryside. Their tanks bore the scars of shrapnel and the chalked nicknames of past victories. Every crew knew its machine as if it were a living thing. Their mission was clear: secure the approaches to Metz, the heavily fortified city guarding the Moselle River. Metz was no ordinary target. It was a fortress complex dating back to the days of the Kaiser, its ring of bunkers and artillery casemates forming one of the toughest defensive networks in Europe. The Germans intended to hold it at any cost, and Patton intended to take it, no matter how bloody the effort. But in the confusion of rapid movement, units were constantly rerouted. Orders changed mid-march. Maps failed to match the terrain. And in one of those many shifts of direction, a single Sherman crew found themselves detached from their column. 5 men unknowingly driving straight toward one of the most improbable encounters of the war. They were not heroes in waiting, just soldiers doing their job. Lieutenant Harold King, a 24-year-old from Ohio, had been promoted too fast. His driver, Corporal Eddie Miller, was 19 and had learned to handle a tank only 3 months earlier. Their loader, Private Lewis Grant, had survived a near-fatal hit at St. Lo. The men were tired, hungry, and wet, but driven by the rhythm of duty. Follow the road, reach the objective, survive the day. Unknown to them, a few miles ahead, the German First Army was in disarray. After weeks of retreat, its command structure was collapsing. Units were scattered, and field headquarters had become mobile. Improvised convoys of staff cars, trucks, and radio vans weaving desperately through rural backroads. Among these was the personal convoy of General Lieutenant Heinrich Freiherr von Auloch, a veteran of both World Wars and commander of a rear area defense group tasked with holding Metz until reinforcements could arrive. Von Aulach's staff car, a sleek gray Opel Admiral, was moving westward that same morning, escorted by a handful of officers and a driver. They believed they were behind their own lines. They were wrong. The fog that blanketed Lorraine that morning blurred every sense of direction. Allied tanks and German convoys moved blindly through the same valleys, unaware of each other's proximity. The landscape itself seemed neutral. Fields of broken wheat, empty barns, villages evacuated of civilians. The war, for a few hours, appeared to have vanished into mist. But for the men of King's crew, the next few miles would dissolve that illusion completely. Their wrong turn would bring them out of the fog onto a narrow dirt road, and face to face with an unsuspecting group of German officers. The encounter would last less than 5 minutes, but it would end with one of the most unexpected captures of the Lorraine campaign. By mid-September 1944, the Third Army's advance had slowed to a crawl. The same momentum that had carried Patton across France now threatened to collapse under its own weight. The problem wasn't courage or command, it was logistics. The famous Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system designed to keep fuel flowing from the Normandy ports, was overwhelmed. Every gallon of gasoline had to travel hundreds of miles just to reach the front. Tanks that once roared east now sat idle, their engines silent, waiting for a single jerry can of fuel. Patton fumed, writing in his diary that, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks must drink." For the crews like Lieutenant Harold King's, this meant long hours of uncertainty, waiting for orders, running reconnaissance, and inching forward when supplies allowed. It was in this precarious moment that the 37th Tank Battalion was tasked with probing south of Nancy, near the Moselle River crossings. The terrain there was deceptive. Rolling hills, narrow forest roads, and small stone villages clustered along muddy rivers. Roads were poorly marked, bridges were often destroyed, and locals, when found, spoke in dialects that few Allied interpreters could understand. At dawn on September 10, 1944, the battalion received orders to move toward the village of Aricourt, where German counterattacks were rumored. The battalion split into smaller groups to cover multiple routes. That division of force, though tactically sound, also made them vulnerable to miscommunication and isolation. Lieutenant King's Sherman tank, Lucky Lady 2, was supposed to follow a column moving southeast, but the map his unit had been issued was outdated by nearly 20 years. Many of the rural roads had been altered, others renamed, and several bridges marked passable were long since gone. When the battalion's column veered north, King's crew, trailing behind in poor visibility, missed the turn entirely. They found themselves alone, 5 men in a 33-ton machine, on a narrow dirt road winding through dense fog and forest. The radio crackled with static. They couldn't raise command. Still, they pressed on. The path led them past burned-out trucks, shattered wagons, and fields littered with spent shell casings. The sounds of battle, distant artillery, scattered gunfire, echoed faintly from miles away. To the crew, it felt like they were moving behind friendly lines. But what they didn't know was that the German 553rd Volksgrenadier Division had been moving through that same region, retreating toward Metz, and the remnants of its rear echelon staff had chosen these roads to escape encirclement. Meanwhile, on the German side, chaos ruled the airwaves. Reports were conflicting. American tanks were said to be everywhere and nowhere. Units that thought themselves safe behind the Moselle were suddenly shelled. Convoys heading east collided with refugees and retreating infantry. Even high-ranking officers no longer trusted their maps. General Lieutenant von Aulach's convoy had been ordered to relocate to Château Salins, where temporary command posts were being established. His staff consisted of a few aides, a signals officer, and a driver, a small team carrying critical documents, radio frequencies, and daily orders. The Opal Admiral leading the convoy bore no markings, just a civilian-looking vehicle cloaked by the fog of retreat. Von Aulach himself was weary. He had fought in the First World War and seen the German armies decline with his own eyes. What had once been a disciplined force had become a patchwork of broken units and half-trained replacements. To him, the retreat from France was not just military, it was moral. For the Allies, capturing such an officer and his staff would be a significant intelligence victory. Yet fate, not planning, was about to make that possible. Around 0930 hours, Lieutenant King's crew reached a fork in the road. The signposts had been shot to pieces, their wooden boards hanging at odd angles. King ordered a halt. He and his gunner, Sergeant Dan Harker, climbed out to check the terrain. The fog was thick, rolling low over the fields. The smell of wet earth and engine oil filled the air. Corporal Miller leaned out from the driver's hatch. "Which way, Lieutenant?" King pointed left. It seemed downhill, easier for the Sherman's weight. What they couldn't see, through the mist and broken hedgerows, was that the road curved toward a small stone bridge spanning a creek. On the far side of that bridge, less than half a mile away, was von Aulach's staff convoy, moving slowly, unaware that an American tank was approaching from behind. It was a collision course written by circumstance. Neither side had any idea the other was near. Moments later, the fog lifted slightly. A glint of sunlight reflected off metal ahead. Harker squinted through the sight. "Vehicles up front," he said. "Civilian type? Wait, no. German plates." Before King could respond, the unmistakable silhouette of an officer's peaked cap appeared through the haze. The tank's engine rumbled. Inside the Sherman, the men exchanged glances, half disbelief, half adrenaline. 5 Americans, alone and lost, had just stumbled upon the mobile, headquarters of a German general. The mistake that led them there, a simple wrong turn, was about to become one of the strangest moments of the Lorraine campaign. To understand how a simple navigational error could lead to the capture of a German general's staff car, one must look at the deeper layers, the human, tactical, and environmental factors that made such moments possible in 1944. The war had reached a stage where confusion itself was a weapon, and for both sides, the boundaries between order and chaos were shrinking by the hour. By the late summer of 1944, few Allied tankers could recall what it felt like to sleep through a night uninterrupted by gunfire or engines. Most crews lived inside their machines, cramped, hot, and reeking of oil and cordite. For Lieutenant Harold King's men, the Sherman wasn't just a weapon. It was home, armor, and coffin all at once. Every mission was driven by a paradox. The faster they moved, the safer they were. And yet, the further they advanced, the more isolated they became. Fatigue eroded precision. It dulled the mind, turned confident men into instinctive ones, navigating with half-readable maps, on empty stomachs, under relentless tension. Even the most experienced crews could lose track of their bearings. And when a tank lost contact with its unit, it rarely turned back. Reversing meant vulnerability. Forward motion meant survival. For King's crew, that mindset dictated everything. When they missed their turn, no one panicked. They assumed they'd rejoin the battalion farther down the line. What mattered was momentum. Keep rolling, keep fighting, keep alive. This human endurance, this balance between exhaustion and resolve, was what separated the living from the dead in Patton's Third Army. It also set the stage for the extraordinary moment that followed. Unlike earlier campaigns, by September 1944, the Western Front had no clear shape. The lightning pace of the Allied advance created a phenomenon historians later called the blurred front. Instead of solid lines, the battlefield was a patchwork of moving zones, Villages liberated in the morning could be reoccupied by Germans at night. Isolated German squads could find themselves behind American armor without even knowing it. For armored units, this environment was both opportunity and peril. A single wrong turn could bring destruction, or, occasionally, an improbable victory. Patton himself encouraged aggression, telling his men that movement was life. His officers often repeated the phrase, "attack until stopped." That doctrine, effective as it was, came with chaos attached. The 4th Armored Division's reports from the Lorraine sector were filled with phrases like unidentified vehicles on secondary, road, and friendly patrol lost contact. 1. Column could be 10 miles from the next, yet both considered themselves the front line. This fluidity explains how Lieutenant King's lone Sherman could drive through occupied terrain without immediate detection. The Germans, in retreat, lacked the coordination to seal every road. Allied tanks often appeared like ghosts, emerging from the mist where no one expected them. And for General Lieutenant von Auloch's convoy, accustomed to the relative safety of the rear, the idea of an American tank deep in their withdrawal zone seemed impossible. Until, suddenly, it wasn't. The Lorraine region is a landscape of contradictions. Gentle hills masking sudden valleys, wide open farmland interrupted by thick forest, and weather that shifts by the hour. In early autumn, fog rolls across its fields like smoke from invisible fires. It clings to the low ground and muffles sound, distorting distance and direction. For the soldiers of 1944, Lorraine's fog was both an ally and an enemy. On that September morning, visibility fell below 150 yards. Tanks could drive for minutes without seeing more than the faint glow of their own exhaust. American crews navigated by instinct, compass, or pure luck. Even aircraft reconnaissance was hampered. Pilots reported losing sight of entire armored columns in the mist. For von Auloch's convoy, this same fog provided cover, until it also became a trap. The winding roads between Moyenvic and Château Salins offered no wide turns, no alternate escape routes. When the Opel Admiral and its escorting vehicles entered that narrow valley, they were effectively blind to what lay ahead. And for King's Sherman, rumbling from the opposite direction, the fog acted as a curtain rising on an unscripted confrontation. The vehicles that collided in that fog were symbols of their nation's strengths and weaknesses. King's crew rode in an M4A3 Sherman, the most common American tank of the war. Its armor was modest, its gun underpowered compared to German panzers, but it was reliable, mobile, and easy to repair. Its gasoline engine, while dangerously flammable, gave it speed and range unmatched by heavier tanks. The Opel Admiral that carried von Auloch was the opposite. Elegant, fast, but fragile. Designed for officers and dignitaries, it was built for roads, not war zones. Its rear seats carried maps, codebooks, and dispatches, an administrative nerve center in motion. That morning, the two machines, one designed for battle, one for bureaucracy, met on a road neither was meant to travel. And in that collision of engineering and chance, the story of the wrong turn was written not by strategy, but by steel and circumstance. The soldiers on both sides were, in that moment, blind to the larger historical picture. The Americans didn't know they were about to capture a general. The Germans didn't realize the enemy was within arm's reach. Each side thought it was alone, and yet, within minutes, history would tighten its grip. The fog was beginning to thin. The faint outline of a staff car emerged through the haze, and somewhere in the Sherman's turret, a hand moved toward the gun trigger. The collision course was set. In the great sweep of World War II, stories like the wrong turn incident were not born from command strategies or deliberate plans. They were the product of men operating on the edge of control, caught between the machinery of war and the unpredictability of the human condition. To fully grasp the depth of what happened that day, we must explore the remaining layers. the psychological, leadership, and enemy angles that made this event not just possible, but inevitable. The physical fog of Lorraine was nothing compared to the mental haze that hung over every soldier in 1944. By September, most Allied tankers had been through continuous combat since Normandy. A brutal grind of advance, contact, repair, and repeat. Sleep came in 20-minute bursts. Meals were ration tins eaten off a tank's glacis plate. The noise, engines, guns, distant screams, became part of the background of existence. Psychologists who later studied tank crews from Patton's army found a phenomenon they called battle tunnel vision. After days or weeks of constant exposure to danger, the human brain begins to narrow its focus, not on the big picture, but on immediate survival. Crews stopped thinking in terms of maps or objectives. Their world shrank to the inside of their steel shell, the voice on the intercom, and whatever appeared through the gun sight. This was the state Lieutenant Harold King's crew lived in when they made their wrong turn. To them, another dirt road looked just like any other. Their only mission was to keep moving, keep the gun ready, and keep the tank alive. They didn't realize that their instinctive persistence, their refusal to stop, would place them at the precise crossroads of history. Meanwhile, the Germans they were about to meet were caught in a different kind of fog. Moral collapse. General Lieutenant von Auloch's staff, trained to believe in the order and superiority of the Wehrmacht, now saw their world disintegrating. The once proud army of Europe was reduced to convoys of weary men fleeing under air attack, short on fuel, short on hope. The war had become a shadow of itself. When von Auloch's convoy rolled through Lorraine that morning, his officers weren't strategizing. They were surviving. The general himself later admitted in his interrogation that he had expected to reach safety without encountering the enemy in such proximity. In that single phrase lay the truth the Germans no longer believed they could control, though battlefield. The psychological collapse of one side and the mechanical persistence of the other would soon meet head-on. At the strategic level, George S. Patton and Heinrich von Auloch could not have been more different, yet both embodied their nation's military souls. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, believed war was movement. He inspired aggression, demanding his officers seize initiative and hold the enemy by the nose while kicking him in the rear. He rewarded risk and punished hesitation. His men knew that success came from action. Even a wrong action could lead to victory if pursued boldly enough. That doctrine, echoing through the ranks, is what placed a lone Sherman on that fateful road. A belief that moving forward was always the right answer. Von Auloch, by contrast, was a man of the old order, Prussian in bearing, methodical in command. He believed in control, discipline, and precision. For decades, he had served an army that prided itself on structure and hierarchy. But in 1944, that structure was crumbling around him. Hitler's interference, the collapse of communication lines, and the chaos of retreat had made traditional command nearly impossible. Von Auloch's staff car symbolized this collapse, a general literally leading from the road, stripped of his fortress, his divisions scattered. When King Sherman appeared through the mist, these two philosophies collided, one driven by audacity, the other crushed by exhaustion, one fueled by motion, the other trapped by inertia. That moment, when American improvisation met German rigidity, encapsulated the turning tide of the war in Western Europe. For the German army, Lorraine was supposed to be a temporary barrier, a delay to buy time for regrouping at the Siegfried Line. But delays require coordination, and coordination demands communication. By September 1944, the Wehrmacht's radio networks were unreliable, its command posts constantly shifting under pressure from Allied air power. Von Auloch's convoy, operating under outdated maps and vague orders, assumed the Americans were still several kilometers west. It was a fatal misjudgment. His driver had taken the safer back roads precisely to avoid the main routes of Allied advance, and in doing so, he drove directly into one. It's easy to judge in hindsight, but for those men in that moment, the chaos of retreat was total. Columns of refugees clogged every road. Fuel depots had been destroyed. Artillery units moved without knowing where the front actually was. The war had dissolved into a storm without shape, where survival depended more on luck than command. King's Sherman, isolated and low on fuel, was also running on luck. Yet that same confusion that threatened to destroy both sides also made the impossible possible. The capture of a general's staff car by a single tank. War has a cruel habit of rewarding chance as much as courage. The story of King's crew is often told as a tale of bravery. And it was. But it was also a story of accident. A misread sign, a foggy valley, two roads intersecting under fate's indifferent gaze. For historians, it is tempting to frame such moments as destiny. But for the men who lived them, they were not grand epics, just survival choices made in seconds. When that Sherman rolled forward through the mist, no one in it imagined that their next decision would alter intelligence reports at Patton's headquarters within the hour. And yet, it would. Because in the chaos of war, sometimes a wrong turn is the only road history remembers. The road narrowed. The fog began to break. Through the glass of the periscope, Lieutenant King saw movement. Figures in gray uniforms, a glint of polished caps, the unmistakable flash of a staff pennant. The Germans saw the tank too late. The angles of confusion, fatigue, leadership, and fate had all converged into one instant. What happened in the next 5 minutes would echo through intelligence briefings and mess halls for weeks to come. The fog had thinned to a pale veil, hanging low over the wet fields of Lorraine. Inside the Sherman Lucky Lady II, the men were silent. Only the low hum of the idling engine broke the quiet. Through his periscope, Lieutenant Harold King could make out the faint outlines of vehicles ahead. 2, maybe 3, their shapes too angular, too clean to be abandoned wrecks. Then came the realization that made his stomach tighten. The dark silhouettes of German uniforms moving around a staff car. King leaned into his headset. Gunner, eyes front. Traverse right. Slow. Sergeant Dan Harker swung the 75mm turret, the gun's snout cutting through the fog like a finger of steel. The figures grew sharper now. An officer in a long coat, another man opening the rear door of the Opel Admiral, a driver climbing out with a map case. It took only seconds to register. This wasn't a retreating infantry patrol. It was command personnel. King knew what that meant. If they were armed, they could call artillery or reinforcements. But if captured, they might hold valuable intelligence. The decision was instantaneous, reflexive, a mixture of instinct and discipline that combat forges into one. He pressed the intercom. Load he. Hold fire until I say. The Sherman rolled forward, its wide treads crushing gravel beneath a low rumble. The Germans turned, confusion first, then panic. The sound of an approaching tank in the middle of their supposed safe zone made no sense. For a moment, none of them moved. The officer nearest the car froze, mouth open, eyes wide behind wire rim glasses. One of the German escorts, a corporal, scrambled for his sidearm. Harker's voice came over the intercom, calm but sharp. "They're reaching!" King hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he spoke one word. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun thundered, the recoil shaking the steel hull. The high-explosive shell detonated 10 yards short of the staff car, sending a geyser of earth and smoke across the road. The Germans scattered, diving for ditches and trees. The blast shattered the rear window of the Opel Admiral, tearing its trunk open like a tin can. King's intent wasn't destruction. It was shock. He wanted surrender, not rubble. And in the eerie stillness that followed, he got exactly that. From the haze, a voice cried out, hoarse, desperate, unmistakably German. Nicht schießen! Don't shoot! Harker swung the turrets slightly, keeping them covered. The loader, Private Grant, reached for his sidearm, hands trembling slightly. Through the periscope, King saw a tall, silver-haired officer emerging from the fog, hands raised high, his uniform immaculate even in chaos. The gold eagle on his cap glinted faintly in the pale morning light. A general. King couldn't believe what he was seeing. Jesus! Harker! Tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing. The gunner's voice was low, incredulous. Looks like we just bagged ourselves a big one, sir. The scene froze in a surreal tableau. 5 Americans in a single tank facing a handful of stunned German officers standing beside their staff car. Neither side had planned for this moment, and for several seconds, no one moved. Then King ordered his driver forward. The Lucky Lady 2 rumbled closer, its gun locked on target. Dust and smoke curled around its tracks. When the tank stopped 10 yards from the Germans, its massive bulk towered over them like an iron wall. King climbed halfway out of the commander's hatch, his .45 pistol drawn but lowered. He shouted, "Hands up! Step away from the vehicle!" The Germans obeyed. The general motioned to his aides, speaking quickly in clipped German. They dropped their sidearms, slowly raising their hands. Corporal Miller climbed out from the driver's seat, covering them with his Thompson. The surrealness of the moment wasn't lost on any of them. 5 Americans, completely cut off, now holding a German general and his staff at gunpoint. In the fog-shrouded quiet, the war seemed to pause. No artillery, no planes, no shouting, just the distant croak of crows and the hissing of the tank's exhaust. When the crew searched the Opel Admiral, what they found confirmed their suspicion. Inside were field maps, coded messages, and a radio tuned to a German high command frequency. The leather briefcase on the rear seat carried identification documents stamped Heeresgruppe G, von Auloch's command. King realized at once the weight of their find. These weren't just prisoners, they were intelligence gold. But the danger wasn't over. They were still alone, deep in contested territory, and the sound of the tank's gunfire might have already drawn attention. The crew could hear distant engines somewhere to the east, trucks, maybe half-tracks. It could mean a German counter-patrol. King gave quick orders. "Grant, keep watch. Miller, get us turned around. We're heading back the way we came. Harker, stay on the gun." The general and his staff were ordered to stand aside. Their expressions were a mix of resignation and disbelief. For men who had commanded thousands, being captured by a single tank was almost beyond comprehension. Von Auloch himself, though shaken, remained composed. He spoke softly in German to one of his aides, then turned to King. In halting English, he said, "You are lost, yes?" King couldn't help but smirk. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. But it looks like we found something worth getting lost for." Within the hour, Lucky Lady the Cado was grinding back along the same dirt road, its treads cutting fresh lines through the mud. The captured officers followed on foot, flanked by Miller and Grant with their weapons drawn. Behind them, the fog swallowed the wrecked Opel Admiral, the general's command post now reduced to smoking steel and shattered glass. Every mile they traveled back toward American lines felt like a gamble. If they ran into Germans, they'd be outnumbered. If they ran out of fuel, they'd be stranded. But luck, the invisible companion of war, was still with them. Near midday, they caught sight of friendly vehicles. Armored cars from the 25th Cavalry Squadron. The sight of the lone Sherman leading a column of captured German officers drew instant attention. The patrol commander, stunned, reportedly asked, "Where the hell did you pick those up?" King's answer was as dry as it was historic. "Took a wrong turn." What began as a navigational mistake had turned into one of the most improbable captures of the Lorraine campaign. Within hours, Patton's intelligence staff had the news. A German general, seized by a single American tank crew operating alone behind the lines. The victory wasn't strategic. It didn't change the course of the war, but it became legend among the men of the 4th Armored Division, a reminder that in war, luck can be just as decisive as bravery, and that sometimes history isn't written by the largest army, but by the one crew that didn't stop when the road turned wrong. The news spread across the forward command post like wildfire. By late afternoon, every officer within Patton's Third Army sector had heard about the tank crew that bagged a general. It sounded too absurd to believe. A 5-man Sherman crew accidentally driving into enemy territory and coming back with a captured German command staff. Yet the evidence stood right there in the open courtyard of a repurposed French farmhouse. A tall, silver-haired general, immaculate in his field-gray uniform, calmly smoking a cigarette under guard. The insignia on his collar left no doubt. General Lieutenant Botho Henning Elster, commander of the German 19th Army remnants operating near the Loire. Lieutenant Harold King and his crew stood off to one side, helmets in hand, watching as intelligence officers surrounded the captured men. They had no idea what to say, or even how to explain what had happened. Colonel Benton, the sector intelligence chief, shook his head in disbelief. "Son," he said to King, "do you have any idea what this means?" King, still coated in mud and exhaustion, replied, "Just that we got lucky, sir." The colonel didn't smile. Luck or not, this could shorten the fight in Lorraine. Over the next few hours, military intelligence officers combed through the captured Opal Admiral, carefully unrolling maps and decoding the radio logs found inside. The documents were far from trivial. Among the papers was a list of supply depots, retreat routes, and coded messages detailing the positions of artillery batteries along the Moselle. It wasn't just a general they had captured. It was his war desk, right there in the back seat. Patton himself, upon receiving the report, is said to have quipped, "Only my boys could get lost and still win a damn battle." But beyond the humor lay a sobering truth. Elster's capture and the subsequent seizure of his staff car gave Allied intelligence a near real-time look into the crumbling state of German logistics in Lorraine. It confirmed what Patton had long suspected. The German army wasn't retreating in good order anymore. It was fracturing. Their fuel lines were thin, their morale lower still, and their high command was scrambling to patch holes faster than they could be torn open. That night, in a dimly lit tent on the outskirts of Nancy, King and his crew were debriefed. Army clerks typed feverishly as the men described every step of their encounter: the fog, the sighting of the vehicles, the single HE round that ended the standoff. When asked if they'd known it was a general, King's answer was simple. "No, sir. We just saw officers. Figured they were trouble." The interrogator leaned back, tapping his pencil. "And none of them resisted after the first shot?" "Not a one," King said. Seemed more shocked than scared. A long pause, then a faint smile. "You realize you just changed someone's career upstairs." By dawn, copies of the report had already been forwarded to the Third Army's G2 section. The intelligence gleaned from Elster's maps would help shape the coming week's operations, including the push toward Saarbrücken. Meanwhile, Elster and his aides sat under guard in a requisitioned farmhouse. Despite his captivity, the general maintained his composure. An interpreter noted how calm he seemed, even polite. When offered rations and coffee, he thanked the Americans in fluent English, remarking dryly, "You handle prisoners better than the Russians." He refused, however, to discuss operational details beyond what was already known. Yet even in silence, his very capture spoke volumes. His absence from the front lines disrupted communication across 2 German corps, a gap that would take days to fill. Every hour he spent as a prisoner was an hour of disarray for the Wehrmacht in the region. For the lucky Lady Turu, the surreal nature of their accidental victory took days to sink in. Back at their field base, they were received as heroes. Not the medal-wearing parade kind, but the quiet legends soldiers talk about around campfires. Harker, the gunner, couldn't stop replaying the moment in his mind. The sight of the general stepping out of the fog with his hands raised. "I thought we were done for," he told another crew later that week. And then suddenly, he just surrendered, like something out of a movie. Private Grant, the loader, joked that he'd almost fired the next shell just from nerves. "Good thing I didn't," he said. "Would have blown history to bits." Within a week, the Army's public relations office had caught wind of the story. Correspondents began filing short features titled things like "The Wrong Turn That Netted a General" and "Sherman, Crew Captures Nazi Command." Newspapers back home loved it. The story of 5 ordinary soldiers turning a navigational blunder into a triumph of initiative. But within the Army, it carried a deeper message. In a war dominated by massive offensives and meticulous planning, it was a reminder of something simpler. Initiative still mattered. Even amid the chaos of modern mechanized war, individual decisions, the courage to act in the moment, could still tilt the scales of history. General Elster would eventually be transferred to a POW camp in the United States, where he spent the remainder of the war. In captivity, he earned a reputation as courteous and pragmatic, even helping to organize camp discipline and lectures for other officers. In post-war interviews, he later recalled that day in Lorraine with a mix of bemusement and respect. "The young American officer," he said, "was very professional. He could have destroyed us all. Instead, he gave us a chance to surrender with dignity." For King and his men, the story ended quietly. After the war, they went home, back to farms, factories, and families. Their unit citation mentioned distinguished initiative under hazardous conditions, but the details never made it into textbooks. Still, among those who served in Patton's Third Army, their tale lived on as a whispered legend that a lost tank, rolling through fog and uncertainty, could stumble upon a general, and in doing so, capture more than just an enemy. They had captured a moment that defined what war truly is: chaos, chance, and courage colliding in a single heartbeat. And as the Lorraine campaign pressed onward, the lessons from that morning remained etched into every tank crew that followed. You never know what lies at the end of a wrong turn, but sometimes it's victory itself. In the weeks that followed the strange encounter near Lorraine, the story of Lieutenant Harold King's crew drifted through the Third Army like a rumor turned gospel. Men repeated it with embellishment. Some swore the Germans were carrying gold, others that the general had been plotting an ambush when the Americans appeared. The truth was simpler, but far more revealing. An entire enemy command cell, captured intact, with their vehicles, maps, and codes, all by a single tank that had taken the wrong turn. Patton's intelligence officers wasted no time. The papers retrieved from General Elster's car were spread across a wooden table at a forward headquarters in Nancy. Analysts pored over every handwritten note, every coded message. The most valuable find wasn't just troop positions, it was the logistics data: fuel convoys, bridge capacities, and ammunition schedules for the retreating German First Army. With that knowledge, the Allies could predict where resistance would stiffen and where it would crumble. Within 5 days, the 13th Corps used this intelligence to redirect its thrust south of Metz, bypassing strong points and cutting supply routes that would have otherwise bled American columns dry. It wasn't dramatic like a tank charge or a bombing raid, but in the language of generals, intelligence was ammunition, and this capture had delivered a full magazine. For General Elster, the fall was humiliating yet strangely civil. He was taken first to the rear lines, then transported under heavy escort to Paris, where American intelligence officers conducted formal interrogations. Elster, a career soldier, maintained his composure even in captivity. He confirmed certain logistical realities, but refused to betray operational secrets, though by then, most of those secrets had already been overtaken by events. On September 16, 1944, just 6 days after his capture, elements of his scattered command surrendered en masse near the Loire. It was the beginning of what became one of the largest organized surrenders of German troops in western France. While the formal surrender would later be signed at Beaugency, Elster's earlier removal from the field had accelerated the process. His absence left subordinate officers, uncertain and demoralized, a vacuum no one could fill fast. Enough, military historians would later note this episode as a minor but symbolic victory in the campaign for Lorraine. A random intersection, a fog-shrouded road, and the domino effect of removing one man from command had shortened the fight by days, perhaps weeks. Meanwhile, the men of the Lucky Lady II were ordered to stand down for maintenance and rest. The Sherman's treads were worn, its armor scratched, its crew running on adrenaline and black coffee. Their battalion commander met them personally at the depot near Toul, offering a handshake and a grin. "Not every tank crew gets a general for a souvenir," he said. King didn't say much. He simply nodded and looked away, still trying to reconcile how one wrong turn had done more than a dozen planned offensives. Back in the mess tent, the men were heroes for a night. Corporal Harker, the gunner, found himself retelling the story for the 10th time, each version growing no less astonishing to his audience. But when the laughter faded and the cigarettes burned down, the crew returned to the quiet that soldiers know too well, the knowledge that luck never lasts forever. In headquarters, bulletins, their action was described in measured bureaucratic language. An American armored vehicle, operating independently, successfully engaged and captured enemy staff personnel of significant rank. Resultant intelligence has contributed materially to current operations. But among the men, the phrasing was simpler. They found a general in the fog. The press would later soften the story into legend, one that families back home would read over breakfast, never realizing how accidental, how human it really was. In war, victories are rarely clean. They are born of confusion, fear, and the raw instinct to act. For the Lucky Lady II crew, that single act of instinct would ripple far beyond the mud of Lorraine. And while the headlines faded, the impact of that encounter only deepened in the days ahead. Because for every piece of intelligence uncovered, the Allies were drawing closer to the heart of Germany itself. By late September 1944, the rains returned to Lorraine, and with them came a grinding stillness. The Lucky Lady II and her crew were reassigned to convoy support, while the rest of the Third Army fought tooth and nail across the Moselle River. For King and his men, the sudden fame had faded into the background noise of war, the endless movement, the diesel fumes, the smell of cordite and wet canvas. Yet, behind the scenes, the intelligence they'd helped capture continued to shape the campaign. The Tourtine Corps used Elster's maps to locate abandoned fuel dumps, enabling American units to refuel deep behind enemy lines without waiting for stretched supply trains. In turn, Patton's armor pushed harder, faster, often catching German defenses off balance. Each success seemed to trace back, in some small way, to that fog-shrouded road and the unlucky general who'd driven straight into a Sherman's sights. Reports from Intercepted. German communications confirmed the psychological blow Elster's capture had delivered. Wehrmacht officers along the Moselle front referred to it bitterly as the Lorraine disgrace. It wasn't just about losing a general. It was about how he'd been taken. Not by an air raid, not by a major assault, but by a single lost tank. The story spread like wildfire through both armies, a dark symbol of how fragile German command had become. By mid-October, General Elster's case drew the attention of Allied command in London. Interrogation transcripts painted him as pragmatic, even disillusioned. He spoke candidly of the futility of further resistance and the moral exhaustion spreading through German ranks. To the Americans, his testimony reinforced what the battlefield already showed, that the Reich's armies in France were no longer fighting for victory, only survival. When word reached Patton, he reportedly remarked to his staff, "Even their generals are surrendering to privates now." Behind the bravado was a kernel of truth. Patton understood the psychology of collapse better than most. Once the chain of command breaks, once subordinates see that even their leaders can be captured by chance, the entire machine begins to seize. The Lorraine campaign would continue into November, fierce and costly. But strategically, it was already decided. German resistance was splintering, coordination faltering, and in that chaos, one American crew's navigational error had become an improbable stroke of precision warfare. Meanwhile, the men of Lucky Lady the Second received orders transferring them to a fresh armored battalion. Their tank was refitted, its side hatch still bearing the faint scratches from shrapnel near Elster's capture site. A war correspondent, visiting the unit for an interview, asked King what he thought of the moment that had made them famous. King didn't hesitate. "There wasn't any glory in it," he said. "We didn't plan it. We just did what we had to do." The reporter pressed him. "Surely it must feel good, knowing they'd helped shorten the war." King paused, then replied quietly, "Good, yes, but mostly it feels like we were just lucky to be alive." It was a sentiment that echoed through the ranks. For all the medals and headlines, no soldier ever forgot how easily fortune could turn. In the winter of 1944, as the Allies prepared for their next great challenge in the Ardennes, the Lorraine incident faded into the background of 1,000 other stories. General Elster would spend the rest of the war in a POW camp in the American South, where he maintained a reputation for discipline and dignity. After his release in 1945, he returned to Germany and lived a quiet life, later giving interviews reflecting on his surrender. "I was captured," he said, "not by superior numbers or overwhelming fire, but by fate. In the fog, on the wrong road, at the wrong hour." That same line would appear decades later in a military journal analyzing command breakdowns during retreat operations. It would quote Elster's capture as a case study in how chaos, geography, and timing can defeat even the best-trained forces. For the U.S. Army, the episode became a brief footnote in the sprawling saga of the European campaign. But among the men who served in Lorraine, it remained a story worth retelling. The day a tank crew's mistake changed the direction of a war. And so, long after the maps were archived and the tanks left to rust, the legend endured. 5 young Americans, a fog-covered road, and a single decision that captured a general and revealed the strange, unpredictable heart of war. War has a way of turning the smallest moments into history. For Lieutenant Harold King and his crew, that morning in Lorraine was never meant to be remembered. They weren't chasing glory or hunting generals. They were simply lost, fighting exhaustion, following a road that seemed to lead nowhere. Yet, from that moment of uncertainty came one of those rare, inexplicable turns of fate that define entire campaigns. Historians often speak of grand strategies, field marshals, and sweeping offensives. But the truth is quieter. It lives in the unplanned decisions of ordinary men. A fog-shrouded crossroad, a misread compass, a commander trusting his instinct instead of the map. And sometimes those moments tilt the course of nations. The capture of General Botho Elster was not a major battle. No medals of valor were pinned on the crew. No monuments were built. But for the soldiers who lived it, it became proof of something larger. that in the chaos of war, the line between disaster and victory is a thread no thicker than luck and courage intertwined. When the war finally ended, and the guns fell silent, men like Harold King went home carrying the quiet knowledge that history is often written by accident. They had not set out to capture a general. They had only set out to survive another day. Yet their story endures because it reminds us of war's true nature: unpredictable, human, fragile. It reminds us that beyond the thunder of tanks and the roar of artillery, there are moments shaped not by command, but by coincidence. And within those moments, we glimpse the strange order hidden within chaos, the kind that makes a wrong turn lead straight into history.